Welcome to the second seminar of today. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Merideth Gattis. It's the first time for her here. She comes from the University of Cardiff, and by training, she's a cognitive psychologist. She's working on many different topics, but if I have to find a keyword that summarizes them all, I would say interaction. Interaction of people with environment, so the mechanisms of interacting with the environment and a cascade of effects in terms of cognitive processes, different cognitive processes. Interaction between parents and children, it's another relevant topic that she addresses, and her talk today will at least in part deal with this. And another topic, another nuance of the interaction is interaction with nature, interaction with the environment in the sense of nature. That's, of course, a very up-to-date new topic. That it's the reason why we establish a connection, the origin, so the common interest that we have for environment, meaning nature, referring to nature. But that's not the only connection that we have, because her training actually was on topics very closely related to metaphor. Her supervisor was Keith Oliak, and she worked in the field of cognitive models and analogical reasoning. And one of her first papers even have the word mapping in the title, right? Mapping conceptual to spatial relationship in visual reasoning. And this is basically metaphors of concepts in space. So I think that these commonalities of interest can go deeper and deeper. And we look forward to hearing from you. And thank you for being here, Merideth.
Thank you very much. So since it's so late in the day, I'm going to stand. And I'm also someone who walks a bit when I talk. So I hope who's ever in charge of filming doesn't mind if I'm moving around after all that effort with filming. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a really interesting and exciting day. And I'm hoping it will end with a bang rather than a blur. So see if I can get this to work.
But it has to be on this monitor. Okay, now it should work.
Great. So you can barely have a look at the internet or open Instagram these days without hearing about a connection. It seems to me sometimes that it's the most common word that you encounter. So brands are all about building emotional connection with you. They don't just want you to buy Nike, they want you to feel Nike. And if you've read Naomi Klein, you know how very insidious that can be. Some companies even call themselves connection, so that when they get the reviews, it says, these are the reviews for connection. Connection is really everywhere that we look. And so we might stop and ask ourselves, what is connection? And we also then might ask ourselves, why does it matter? This image from the artist Barbara Kruger really sums up a very good reason why we need to ask ourselves, wait, what is connection? So here, in other words, I'm defining why does it matter in terms of why does it matter what connection is. I'm going to come back to different ways of asking that question. Why does it matter? So here, the image very clearly points out, juxtaposed with that really classic Barbara Kruger text, that there are different ways of defining connection, and just what it means might really vary. So, oops, gone a little too fast. Today I'm going to walk you through quite a lot of literature, and a lot of it not my own, by the way. I'm going to start with social psychology. Social psychologists have been studying social connection for a very long time, and I'm going to draw on their literature to ask how do they define it historically, and also how do they measure it historically. And then I'm going to move on to developmental work. There I'm going to primarily draw on my own work about parent-infant relationships, but I'll try to point out that that work builds on decades of work by other people. I think it's just very useful as putting forward another way of thinking about how we might define connection. And then I'm going to shift to another way of talking about connection, the idea that connection can go beyond the human, in particular, that we can be connected to something like nature. And I'm going to lay the groundwork for talking about maybe there's an analogy that people are making about what they mean about connection when they talk about it in different contexts. All three of those are then going to set up a proposal that I'd like to make to you about a new way of defining connection. It's really a multiplicity of new ways, but I hope in a unified framework. So let's start with social psychology. And social psychologists have frequently studied what does it mean for people to be connected to other people. They pointed out that connection is really, oh, do I need to stand closer to the mic? The connection is really not just a matter of, for example, quantity of social connections that we might have, but rather it's about a feeling of closeness that we have to others. And I want you to hold on to that idea as really the core idea about how social psychologists define connection, about a feeling of closeness to others. So for example, Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary put forward a really important and influential idea about connection when they said that the desire to feel connected to other people was a fundamental human need that was there for really everyone, and that it drove all sorts of other behaviors as well as psychological outcomes. The neuroscientist Julia Holt-Lundstad has drawn on that work and really built a kind of new model in which she's argued that connection is multivariate and continuous in nature. So she points out, for example, that there are structural aspects to connection that might have to do with that quantitative aspect I mentioned just a moment ago, your network size. But there are also functional aspects of connection that might have to do with, for example, the extent to which you actually receive support from others. And then there's the quality of connection. And this one is the one that connects most clearly with that idea of feelings of closeness. So the extent to which you feel satisfied in relationship with another. And Holt-Lundstad asked that question about why does connection matter? Here pointing to why does it matter in terms of outcomes for humans, and reviewed a great deal of evidence that really points clearly toward the fact that social connection matters for all sorts of aspects of human health and well-being, but furthermore that that's bi-directional. So for example, if you might have, let's say, some kind of functional impairment that creates some kind of risk for social connection for you, which in turn might impact on behavioral factors, biological factors, or psychological factors. That impacts on morbidity, but also impacts on how you experience that risk factor. So a really complex model, in other words, that Holt-Lundstad put forward. After all that complexity, it's kind of funny to say that the absolutely most common way of measuring social connection is a single item measure. I know that some of you are linguists, but some of you have experience working with psychological measures, and single item measures are a bit of a dirty word, aren't they? They're very, very rare. And when I first came across the inclusion of other in self scale, I thought that's the most absurd thing I ever heard of, that they think that they could measure this. But it's actually proven to be quite a robust measure of people's sense of social connection. It's also proven to be extremely flexible. the way it works is extraordinarily simple. People see different kinds of diagrams that involve two circles and that vary in the extent to which they overlap. We're now using this measure in a dynamic system that allows you to actually manipulate the closeness, which produces much more lovely data, as anyone who works with continuous data will know. But the traditional version is just different kinds of diagrams, and people are simply asked, for example, please circle or choose the diagram below that best describes how you feel. The words here just barely matter, I must say. How you feel, your relationship, your closeness, it varies across many studies. It turns out to be extremely robust. For example, serving very well as a predictor for other sorts of outcome variables. So very, very simple way of measuring that simple definition that is similar to how social psychologists have defined connection, your feeling of closeness. And it has this really lovely kind of spatial analogy, really, we could say, which might be one of the reasons that it works so well. Robin Dunbar and his colleagues are, of course, very interested in social connection, and they've worked with more continuous measures. I think that's definitely the way for people to go, rather than 5 or 7 different choices. But they were kind of the leaders in this. And one of the questions that they were interested in, for example, was, does the frequency with which you see people determine your feelings of emotional closeness? And that's what you see plotted here. Here, the question for people was to identify how long it had been since they had seen some particular individual. And also later, they were asked to rate their emotional closeness with those individuals, and they did that for many, many different individuals. And it produced this really nice, smooth curve where you feel closer to the people that you've seen more recently. So in other words, there's a kind of physical closeness that goes along with that feeling of closeness as well. There's other ways that social psychologists have measured feelings of social connection that are the more canonical multi-item scales. So for example, people read a statement like, it has been easy to relate to others, or I feel isolated from other people. And Weaver and colleagues use this kind of multi-item scale to look at the relation between feelings of social connection and age. I want to point you to, first of all, and that's what you see plotted there on the x-axis. And anyone who's worried about getting older, I just point you to this graph, because as you get older, you feel closer to other people, you feel more socially connected. People hardly ever mention the good things about getting older. There are actually quite a few of them. But unexpected events come along, and in this case, as they were doing their data collection, along came the pandemic. And so the blue line represents the data that they collected before the pandemic, and the red line represents repeated measured data after the onset of the pandemic. And so the pandemic made people feel less close, and that was consistent for people of all ages. But interestingly, it's nice to see that that relation between age and social connection remained the same. So that tells us it's quite a robust finding. Social connection is also dynamic, and by that I mean it depends on the context that we're in at a particular moment. When I talk about my own data, by the way, I'm going to whiz through it really quickly, but I'm happy to answer questions about the details later. My colleagues and I were interested in the ways that different kinds of environments might shape our feelings of social connection to others. The way this study was set up was that people participated in a repeated measures, or in other words, within subjects design. If I use any terminology about experimental design that you don't know, raise your hand and I'm happy to answer those kinds of things. So this is a within subjects design in which people participated twice in 2 different environments together with a partner, and they did not know that partner. We measured separately their familiarity with partner just to make sure of that. So I'll just leave them as an unknown partner for now. And each time they had a kind of search task that they needed to do. These were university students. And we are very, very lucky. This isn't actually a photograph from Butte Park, but we're very lucky to have an absolutely enormous park right next to Cardiff University called Butte Park. And so they did a search task in Butte Park with a stranger. And they also did a search task that was slightly different in terms of what they were doing in a university office. So both times searching together with someone that's unfamiliar, a different person each time, just to be clear. So they're not, doing it again with the same kind of person. Each time they did it, both before and after, we asked them to leave that inclusion of other in self single item measure. But what we measured was not their feelings of closeness to the other student they were in study with, but their feelings of closeness to other students generically. And that seemed really powerful to us as a test here, because what we wanted to know was, if you meet a new student and do something with them, does the environment influence your feelings of closeness to students more generically? And it did. Students, after completing the search task in the natural environment, felt closer to students more generically. So in other words, social connection is dynamic. It's being influenced by the environments that we're in all the time. It's not just about our recent exchanges with other people or exactly what they've said to us. It's also about the environment that we're in. So social psychologists have by and large defined connection in terms of proximity to others. But as you can see, kind of humorously illustrated here, it's not just about being physically proximate, it's about feeling emotionally proximate to others. And now I would like to shift to work on parent-child interactions, and in particular, work that's focused on observations of behavior as a way of thinking about another way of defining connection. And as I said here, I'm primarily going to draw on my work, but this draws on actually decades of work from other people, including my collaborator, Mark Ornstein. So one of the most remarkable things to me about humans is the way that we attend to other people, and in particular, the way that we attend to what other people attend to. It happens so quickly that we barely notice it at all. Someone looks in a particular direction as they're speaking to us about someone that we don't know, and we almost intuitively think, maybe that's the person they're referring to. So we follow gaze all the time, and furthermore, we're using gaze to draw inferences about the communications that we have with other people. We've done many different studies over the past 2 decades, I would say, in which we've been interested in the origins of this ability to attend to others. And here I'm drawing on 2 different studies that we did, both of them longitudinal studies beginning at birth. Yes, I am a bit of a masochist. I've done 3 longitudinal studies beginning at birth. In the first of those studies, we put children in an experimental setting, in which you see in the top left there, the experimenter speaking to an infant that's not actually an infant in the age range for our study, but rather a colleague who helped me along with his baby by posing for this. So the experimenter sits across from the baby and has 2 identical puppets and speaks to the baby in slow, continuous speech, turns to one of the puppets, turns back to the baby, turns to the other puppet, and so on over 4 trials. And what we're interested in is, at what age do babies demonstrate the capacity at an above chance level to turn to the same puppet that the experimenter turned to? And we were interested in this because for a very long time, people claimed that this ability to attend to what others attend to first emerged at 9 months. We began our study, as I said, at birth. I mean, we didn't really make them come in and do this at birth, but we tested them at 1, 2, and 3 months. Here we're reporting an analysis from all of the babies that have complete data from 2 months onward. You might imagine we had a lot of missing data at 1 month. Anyone who's worked with little babies knows that. And what you'll see is quite surprising really to us as well. Babies reached an above chance level by 3 months on this task of attending to what others attend to. Furthermore, we also tested those same babies in a naturalistic observation with their parent, and then we coded the extent to which they attended to the object that their parent was engaged in. And performance on the experimental task was correlated with performance in the naturalistic task. In a more recent study, we looked at infants born at varying gestational ages, and we compared them in a comparison where all of them were chronologically 5 months, which means they were 5 months after they were born, but they therefore differed in maturity at the time of testing. And there we were able to show that that relation between performance on the 2 different kinds of measures, experimental and naturalistic, is related to maturity in infants. So in other words, in addition to there being social influences on connection and behavior, there appear to be biological influences as well. Another way that we can look at connection between parents and infants is to look at their vocal interactions. If you've looked at Instagram, you've probably seen some of these amazingly cute videos of some pre-linguistic baby babbling away in perfect timing, exchanging with their parent. And it's especially funny depending on the parent's sense of humor about the whole thing and their capacity to sort of lead what's happening there. So we were interested in the age at which this capacity of vocal parenting emerged. And here in another longitudinal study, we're presenting data. By the way, this is the paper with Steve that I told you about. We're presenting data where we analyzed the vocal turn taking from, you can't really see the x-axis at all, but it's from 3 months to 18 months. And we sampled close in time. These babies were tested monthly. We sampled close in time here for this study. So 3, 4, and 5 were those first 3 data points. And then in larger gaps, 9 months, 12 months, and 18 months. And there's a lot of data up here. The main takeaway really is that it was quite remarkable how similar babies' performance was from the early stages at which we sampled their turn-taking behavior. So we looked at the overlap in their utterances, the gap in their utterances, and the within turn pauses. This all comes from Steve Levinson's work, the sort of operational definitions here. And what you can see, for example, is that if you look on the bottom left here, you can see the infant is the top line there, and the y-axis there is the percent of turns in overlap. And very early on, infants are statistically worse than the adult, their parent, but they're not that far away either. And it converges incredibly quickly in development. And so overall, what we can see from this is that this behavioral fitness in terms of responsiveness between parent and child happens extremely early in development. What's really important about both of the definitions that I'm giving you here is they're defining a kind of connection between 2 individuals in terms of the mutuality of behavior. So where a social psychologist asks someone, think of this person and how close you feel to them, here we're defining a kind of connection by defining it in terms of mutual responsivity. There's a reciprocity that's required for this kind of connection. We've also looked at how different environments shape that kind of behavioral indicator of closeness. This is work with Thea Cameron Faulkner, who some of you may be familiar with. And here what we did was very similar to the study that I described with university students, but these studies were conducted with 3- and 4-year-old children and their parents. We told them, go on a treasure hunt and see what you can find. They did that with their parents, so that means they were paired with someone who was familiar, but also that they did it with the same person each time. So it's a within subjects design, in other words, here. And that's because we're no longer interested in this kind of subjective judgment of closeness, but rather in a kind of behavioral closeness. And what we were interested in was their conversational connectedness. And we used the definition of conversational connectedness in terms of related terms. And I'll give you an example in just a moment of those. The 2 environments in which they did it were, again, Butte Park, this amazing park. If you think of the park that's around the castle here, maybe a little bit like that, but like very, very big, and you don't have to pay admission. And our indoor environment in this case was the education center in the park, which is really lovely. I kind of thought of it as a great stand-in for a home because it was really nicer than anyone's home living room could be. For example, there were lots of different activities for parents and children to do, lots of space, lots of light, and there's even a lot of plants inside. I don't know if you can see that in the photos. So here's an example of how we define conversational connectedness. I see it overlaps just a tiny bit, but you can see we've marked parent and child. So if a parent said, I can see a dog over there, and the child's next utterance was, can I climb that tree? Well, that doesn't really count. I shouldn't have put 1 and 2 there. That's actually 1 and 1, sorry. So essentially the second utterance isn't related to the first utterance, and therefore it only counts as a turn of 1. We chose 3- and 4-year-old children, by the way, very intentionally, because of course they have a lot of language at this age, but they're really, really poor at executive function. So in other words, they're also generally not very good at conversational turn taking. An example of a more connected exchange is a parent said, what shall we go and look for? And the child said, frogs. Parent said, frogs, where would we find frogs? The child said, in a pool. Parent said, I don't know if there is a pool. So that's an extended exchange where, because each of the utterances is conceptually related to the previous one, it counts toward this index of conversational connectedness. Is everyone with me for that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what we found, and we had different ways of measuring this, they all kind of show us the same picture, but I'll tell you the easy version of it here, is that there were more connected terms outdoors in the natural environment compared to indoors in the really lovely built environment. That held up when we looked at individuals. So it didn't matter who the responder was or the initiator was, in other words.
Just a clarification question. So what you call that is a lexical connection, like what we would call cohesion, basically.
Yeah.
Having the same terms or
Yeah. And maybe I'll just add, Theo was responsible for these analyses, but I'll add that we spent a little bit of time talking about how connection should be defined. And I felt very strongly that it should be defined around cohesion and not simply time. So some time. So for example, if you use the Lena device, Lena codes turn taking in terms of the temporal proximity of utterances, but you could be saying anything you want. And it doesn't need to be conceptually related in any way for Lena to count it as connected, as long as it happens in a certain time window. By comparison, I felt strongly that it needed to be conceptually related to count as turn taking. And that sets a little bit of a high standard for 3- and 4-year-olds. It's hard for some of my friends who are my age. You know, I say something and they say like, yes, da, da, da. It has, I think, wait, that has nothing to do with what I said. So, you know, you probably all experience that it can be very difficult for adults, for us too, not just them. And so it set the high standard for 3 and 4-year-olds. And so effectively what we're asking is, what can facilitate 3 and 4-year-olds' performance in that interaction with their parents? And a lot of the time when clinicians of different sorts are interested in supporting parent-child interactions, they put a lot of time and effort into training parents to behave in a particular way, or training parents to train their children to behave in a particular way. But one of the things I really like about this study is it shows perhaps we should just invest a little bit of money in the environment in which these families live, because that might be able to support some of the things that you're looking for in terms of outcomes. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay, so responsive relationships like this are really important because we know that they impact on health and on developmental outcomes in a wide variety of ways. So for example, connected turn picking is related to language development. And so it really matters how we define connection here, because it matters to the individual child or for the parent-child dyad that we're looking at. So the definition of connection that I'm proposing here, drawing on our work and on many decades of work from developmental psychology, is that connection is reciprocal. It's not simply how close I feel to you, it's how close we behave. So now I'd like to shift to talking about that third area where we can look for a definition of connection. And this is work that by and large has come from environmental psychology, but it is work that has spread like wildfire over many different disciplines. And now there are many researchers, for example, in environmental sciences more broadly, who are using a lot of the assumptions here. The simple idea in this area of research, I'd like to call it a kind of analogy, is that our sense of connection can extend beyond the human, and we can be connected to all sorts of other things. In particular, we can feel connected to nature. So I'd like to start at a rather ugly bit, though, because a lot of researchers are motivated to study this, not by the connection itself, but rather by concern about a kind of disconnect. So if you look, it doesn't matter in popular media, in policy documents, or in research publications, what you'll see is a lot of concern about the idea that humans are becoming disconnected from nature. And many people point toward all sorts of different causal factors or potential causal factors. So for example, it might be something about the environments in which we spend most of our time. It might also have something to do with the devices that now consume a lot of our attention. So there are many researchers, for example, looking at potential relations between screen time and nature connection as well. And some people would point toward, for example, things like our food production systems, and say that our food production systems these days alienate us from our natural environment more broadly, and that's what's causing our disconnect from nature. Thomas Beery and his colleagues pointed out that it's really many different factors probably that influence that disconnection from nature, and that we really need to not ignore the issue of inequality in shaping nature and connection as well, because inequalities have a very important influence on the opportunities to experience nature. Governments pay tremendous attention to this these days. I'm sorry, I don't know the similar kinds of Italian documents, but here I've just pulled up a few examples from UK government policy. I'm going to guess that it's somewhere in Italian policy as well. It's definitely in, some of the EU documentation that I see coming out. It's not difficult to find these days. So for example, the UK government published a policy statement. This is actually from the previous government prior to Starmer, called the 25-year plan to improve the environment, in which they stated explicitly that improving nature connection should be one of the main aims of the government in terms of their environmental agenda. So for example, from chapter 3, it's actually called Connecting People to the Environment to Improve Health and Well-Being, encouraging children to be close to nature, greening towns and cities. And what I particularly like to point you to is how did they define connection then? So how they define connection draws heavily on the definition that social psychologists use. And that is that connection to nature is fundamentally about a feeling of closeness. And so, for example, here they say connection to nature is one of a set of constructs that refer to an individual's subjective sense of their relationship with the natural world. It relates to a person's sense of their interconnectedness with nature or their sense of inclusion with nature. And this is really the dominant framework across not just environmental psychology, but really environmental sciences broadly, and I would say even a lot of public health and government policy and so on. By far the dominant way of defining connection. They've also asked questions like, is there an association between connection to nature and health, well-being, and educational outcomes? This is kind of the golden thread that people are looking for. And the bottom line for them is that the quality of the evidence is really poor and the strength of the associations is very small. Similarly, they've asked, does connection to nature influence environmental behaviors and perception? And here they end up with the same conclusion. The quality of the evidence is very poor and the strength of the observed associations are very small. So we're left, in other words, in a little bit of a conundrum. And we might ask ourselves, why is that? Well, people have measured nature connection in different sorts of ways, and I'd like to give you a really quick tour through the ways that they've measured it, but also what the data tends to look like when you measure it in those ways. So for example, there are multi-item scales, just like I told you that social connection is sometimes measured in terms of multi-item scales, and people might read statements like, everything in nature is connected, and then rate it in terms of agreement versus disagreement with that statement. Or I enjoy spending time in nature and rate it in terms of agreement versus disagreement. This is just one scale of many multi-item scales, but they tend to have very similar properties. And even if you're not someone who processes a lot of data, I bet you can spot that skew. So it tends to be not at all nicely distributed data, and really instead toward the top of the scale, the responses on that. There's a single item measure that is analogous to the inclusion of other in self scale. It's called the inclusion of nature in self scale. And it is very similar. So for example, here's the visual version of it. Choose the picture which best shows how close you feel to nature. And people might choose between here. There are 5 different examples of varying degrees of overlap between one circle representing the self and the other circle representing nature. And here's what the data looks like in one study of ours. This is from a study with adults that we ran. It's not quite as bad. It actually has slightly better distributions compared to those multi-item scales. I just find that so perplexing and surprising, I cannot tell you. So it has slightly nicer properties, but you can see that people still tend to answer more toward the top end of the scale. So why does it matter how we define connection when we think about nature connection? Well, one of the reasons it matters is that there are all sorts of potential interventions to improve people's connection with nature, but we need empirical evidence about the efficacy of these interventions. And if the measures yield scores that are near the top of the scale before the intervention ever happens, it's going to be very difficult for us to produce evidence that the interventions themselves are efficacious. So, for example, I'm working with a international conservation charity called WWT. We recently have new funding from UKRI, and I'll very soon be looking for a postdoc, by the way, for this project. And so we've been asking ourselves through this kind of work, how should we be measuring nature connection in order to evaluate whether or not giving children the opportunity to spend time in nature, and as WWT would call it, develop a relationship with nature, actually is effective in improving their sense of connection. But we need better instruments in order to be able to judge that. So here's what some data looks like from one of my PhD students. And what you see on the left is the pre-visit. These are really large data sets. I couldn't say exactly, but 2,000 or 3,000 children here all around the UK. All of the children attend schools that meet a threshold for disadvantage. So in other words, nearly all of the children in this study are living in poverty. They generally have very limited access to nature. Despite that, what you can see, the most common response before they ever participated in the intervention program was the top of the scale for them. We actually found that taking part in Generation Wild, WWT's intervention program, improves their connection to nature. But the effect sizes are very small. Not surprisingly, I think it really made a difference. There's an extremely large sample here. And I think it's a robust finding, but what we want to know is, are those effect sizes genuinely small, or is this just some kind of problem about the way we're approaching this question of what connection is when we talk about connection to nature? So I've argued here that connection can extend beyond the human, but fundamentally, I'd like to point out this is a kind of analogy that people are making. And they're drawing on an analogy about social connection to define nature connection. And so perhaps not surprisingly then, they're defining it as feelings of closeness. Now, in the final part of my talk, I'd like to show you what I think one alternative might be for thinking about connection in a way that's slightly different. And it doesn't have the nice, neat package that any of these scales do. I'll tell you up front. So here's my proposal about defining connection differently. I'm going to draw.
What was it?
Oh, it's that's right. I leave it up to you. You're the expert. You know what? You guys are the perfect crowd for this. So I'm going to draw a little bit on work that comes from a kind of blend between computer science and organizational structure, network theory about relationships. So up until now, I've acted like connection only exists between two entities or individuals. I've acted like connection is something that resides in a dyad. And I've done that slightly deceptively, I'll admit, but it's also something that by and large is what psychologists have done when they've looked at connection. But when we look toward organizational theory, for example, one of the things that we find is that, of course, social networks have all sorts of different shapes. They're not simply about dyads. And so, for example, in the top left, you can see an illustration of a relation between two, but you can also have a kind of local network where multiple people are either related to each other in some kind of very complex way or in some kind of very structured way. The main thing I want to take from this is, first of all, that there are multiple ways of being connected. And second of all, I want to steal this iconic image here, which is about nodes. So each individual here is represented by a node, which is in a circle. and about edges. And the edges here are meant to tell us about connections between people. And I'm going to ask you to hold on to that for what I'm going to present to you. So in the first part of my talk, I talked about how social psychologists define connections. And that is loosely depicted in the image on the left. It's about feelings of closeness, but you're only measuring that kind of feeling of closeness in a unidirectional way. And that's how I'm going to refer to this kind of image from now on, is a unidirectional connection. In the second part of my talk, I tried to tell you about a different way of thinking about connection, drawing on research about observed behavior between individuals. And I gave you the example of a parent and a child, but it could be any two individuals. The key issue there was that the way in which we're looking at connection is about defining a kind of reciprocity between the individuals. And so from now on, I'll refer to that as a reciprocal connection, or sometimes I'll slip up and call it a mutual connection, because I can never quite decide what I think the language should be around this. So that might seem like that's the world of connection. But there are times when, for one reason or another, it's very difficult for us to think of connection in that idealistic, reciprocal connection way. And it seems a bit of a shame to think of it then being reduced to the unidirectional. And so I want to propose that there's a third kind of connection that's very important to understanding what connection actually is, and also the implications of connection, not only for human psychological functioning, but also for planetary functioning as well. And that is that those nodes can be in a kind of feed-forward chain. From now on, I'm going to refer to this as a transmission chain, or sometimes I'll probably just call it a chain. So in other words, it might not always be possible to feed back to wherever you got something from, but you might feed it forward instead. And I wanted to try to test these ideas by, first of all, looking at cultural artifacts around us and asking, can we gather some evidence from the cultural artifacts around us and then put them to an empirical test by asking people to make judgments about connection based on those cultural artifacts? Oh, there's my reminders about what they're called. So I'll just point out that this whole way of thinking about connection is drawing, for me at least, on analogical reasoning. It's extremely surprising to me that I've never found any reference whatsoever in, for example, the literature on nature connection, about the idea that nature connection is fundamentally an analogy with social connection. I've never really found any interest there. But to me, it's really important that we think about it, because when we think about analogy, one of the things that we really gain from analogy is the possibility that essentially we can look at one kind of set of relations, compare them to another set of relations, and then we can draw inferences that are hitherto unknown to us by looking at the comparison between the two. And so that's really what we wanted to draw on here more explicitly. I'm also drawing on a relatively old tradition in psychology that's been, I think, underutilized, and that is what's called vignette studies, or here, experimental vignette studies. How many people have heard of vignette studies before? No one. Okay, so a really simple summary of vignette studies is that you have some kind of story that people read. And that story might have some set of properties that are predefined by your experimental design. And then you're asking people to make judgments about those stories in some way. It's actually very similar to the setup for analogical reasoning when I think about it. But here, you're not just interested in the final judgment, the way you often are in studies about analogical reasoning, but rather you're interested about the judgments about each and every one of the stories. And there's lots of really complex statistical papers about how you should evaluate the data. I stuck to something really simple here. Did you have a question? Okay. So we gathered cultural artifacts about different types of connection, quite intentionally thinking of these three different potential models of connection. Anyone know who this is? Absolutely. Pierre and Marie Curie served as a kind of example, potentially, of that kind of reciprocal connection. And participants read a story that came from the Marie Curie website. That's a charity in the UK. And it's pretty closely what's on their website, in other words. So the idea was to look for cultural artifacts that are already out there, to modify them absolutely minimally so that they were always told in the third person. This was already told in the third person. A few of the artifacts that we found were told, for example, in the first person. And we just altered it to make it the third person, for example. So the story that they read was about the relationship between Marie and Pierre. And I'm not going to read it all to you, but you can see, if you don't know very much about them already, they had a very close relationship. When they won the Nobel Prize for Physics, it was initially awarded to Pierre, and Pierre actually went to the committee and insisted that Marie's name be included. And I did not know this, actually, that Pierre was killed while they were really still quite young in an accident, a kind of freak accident from a horse-drawn vehicle. And that even though, of course, Marie was very impacted by this, she really took inspiration from everything that had happened and dedicated her career to building on the opportunities that he had given her through that recognition from the Nobel Committee, and dedicated much of her work to him. So we didn't change anything, it was just out there, in other words, but it seemed like a really good target as a rather idealistic version of that reciprocal connection. Another example of a story, and all the younger generation will probably be familiar with this. My daughter told me about this one. Came from, it's an example of a unidirectional connection that came from the New Yorker magazine. And this story was actually written in the first person by Joe Garcia. So here's an example of how we very lightly modified something. The first time Joe Garcia heard about Taylor Swift, he was in a Los Angeles County jail waiting to be sent to prison for murder. His only source of music was a borrowed pocket radio hooked up to earbuds that cost $3 at the prison commissary. He heard tracks from Red, Swift's fourth studio album, virtually every hour. He was bored, but he was starting to enjoy them. There was in her voice something pleasant and good, something that implies happiness, or at least the possibility of happiness. When Joe listened to her music, he felt that he was still part of the world he left behind. So this was a candidate for a more unidirectional relationship. I hope that's obvious. Taylor had never met Joe. And then for our transmission chain, we again drew from popular magazines, and I'm pretty sure this came from the New Yorker as well. A lot of these stories, by the way, centered, it was very interesting to me to find that they centered often around family heirlooms. David inherited the Betty Crocker cookbook for Americans. It's like a classic kind of cookbook, very old fashioned. From his great aunt Elizabeth, the cookbook was a gift from his great grandfather to Elizabeth. The pages are torn and worn with time and the preparation of many meals. There are handwritten notes in the margins. David's father told him that Elizabeth was a cook and quilter who taught her children how to prepare meals. Cooking was not only how she showed love, but it was also like alchemy. David treasures the cookbook. He uses it regularly. He has used it to teach his own children how to prepare meals. So this one was written in the third person, and we just pretty much lifted it from, I see it's from the New York Times. And we found quite a few stories like this. I'm only going to give you 3 examples of stories so that it's not overwhelming, but I'm just trying to illustrate for you that some of them seem to nicely fit that idea of reciprocal connection. Some of them seem to nicely fit that idea of unidirectional connection. And delightfully, some of them seem to fit that idea of a transmission chain. So the participants' instruction was to, first of all, read the story and then to briefly describe the relationship. And then afterwards, they rated the connection. I'm going to tell you about the rating before I tell you about what they said, just because I think it will make a little bit more sense to you. But I do want to point out that from the participants' perspective, talking about it came first. And I think that's really important in this kind of study. And so here what you see is they had a sliding scale from 1 to 100 to rate the connection between any two individuals in the vignette that they read. And Marie and Pierre were rated the highest up there. Can I make a little light? Is that, there we go. Marie and Pierre were rated the highest up there. So this isn't about categorizing. In other words, this is about trying to understand what people are doing when they're giving a scalar rating, because up to now, that's by and large all we have. And the relation between Joe and Taylor, which was phrased as rate the connection that they had, was the lowest out of all the vignettes that people read. And I'm going to skip over some of the ones that are in between. Like here, these were intended for us to be things that seem like they might have some properties of unidirectional and some properties of reciprocal. So they were allowing us to kind of test out those possibilities because, of course, not everyone is like Marie and Pierre. And not everyone is like Joe and Taylor either. But instead, I'm going to focus your attention here. Both of these are transmission chains. And what you see is that ratings of connection for transmission chains are higher than ratings for unidirectional relationships. But they're not as high as the really idealistic reciprocal connection. Are you with me now? Okay. So now I'd like to show you the kinds of things that they talked about when they talked about the relation that they just read a story about. So they couldn't see the story anymore. And the instruction to them was briefly describe the relation between X and Y. So 2 individuals from the vignette that they just read. And so, for example, and this preceded, just to say again, this preceded the rating that they gave. So, for example, one person commented they wanted to give each other the recognition they thought they each deserved, they both value each other. It's a reciprocal relation, it's a mutual relation. I didn't quite expect participants to tell me so literally what I was looking for, but it was really nice to see that. So in other words, everything that they said, oops, I might have hit the wrong thing, indicated that they interpreted this as an example of a reciprocal relation. Here's the kind of things they said about Joe and Taylor. Whilst Joe might feel connected to Taylor, they're not connected because connection works both ways. And Taylor didn't know about Joe. He feels connected to her, but not her to him. The connection is one-sided and distant. However, it's still meaningful for Joe. I love that they like carried through and like points out for Joe, it matters. It's one-sided, it's meaningful for Joe as it gave him happiness. So it really perfectly captures that idea about the unidirectional connection. And here's examples of what they said about the stories that by and large were about inheriting objects that have a family connection and value each other and family traditions. Sometimes they pointed out something that seems kind of like a unidirectional relationship. That's one of the things I want to acknowledge. So, you know, whereas this one makes it sound like it's reciprocal, this one makes it sound like it's unidirectional. But lots of people pointed out the extent to which it is a kind of transmission chain. So they said things like, David uses the cookbook Elizabeth gave him to teach his children how to cook. I don't think that's in the story, but that's okay with me. I think that's pretty cool. Through the cookbook, Elizabeth's passion is being passed down through generations. So in other words, people really saw this kind of story as an example of a transmission chain. So then we also asked people two further judgments. We asked them to think about their family, and then later we asked them to think about nature. And for each of those, we asked them, how would you describe, so here they did the rating first, how would you describe the connection between your family and other people in your family, or how would you describe the connection between you and nature? And we also asked them to think about which of the stories that relation was most similar to. So here's the kind of ratings that they gave. Family connection ratings were considerably higher than nature connection ratings. And it's very rare when you do a study in psychology that you say, yay, I got really low values. But here's an example of something that seemed like, okay, that seems like that might be more like the values that we think might be out there in the world. And we're looking for ways to approach measurement that might be better approximations of the real values in the world.
Excuse me, it's the same sample, the study you showed earlier.
Of the,
Connection.
no, these are completely different participants. Yeah. These are completely different participants.
Not kids.
But these people, no, there's none of them are children. They're all adults, and they've never taken part in another study about nature connection. This is their first time part in a study about nature connection. And here the kind of average score that we see, as well as really the range that we see, is much closer to what we think might actually be out there in the world. So it might be a better approximation, in other words. But keeping in mind here, we've kind of contextualized that relation by making the analogy a little bit more obvious to them. So when we ask them which of the stories is most similar to the connection, either between you and other people in your family or between you and nature, what we wanted to know was, is it the case that those stories might be a little bit diagnostic? Might they help us understand how people perceive their connection in a categorical way rather than a scalar way? So before, we've been looking at a scalar way because we want to try to relate it to the existing literature. But I'm proposing a kind of categorical approach to thinking about connection, because that might be really helpful for us thinking about the way that people conceptualize connection. And this is really messy data, but the main thing that I want you to notice here is that when it came to their family, people were much more likely to choose relations that seemed closer to that kind of reciprocal source story. So they chose stories that these are family stories, and this is, can anyone guess who that is? A really famous pair of friends, not in a family, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And so we wanted to have a kind of wide range of relationships that might seem somewhere between reciprocal and unidirectional. And people were much more likely to choose those kind of stories. But when it came to nature, people were more likely to choose stories that were either about transmission chains or about a unidirectional relationship. And this is just the beginning, I might point out, for our data, but I think it gives us a really promising insight into the possibility of thinking of connection in a more categorical way that doesn't rule out the possibility of thinking of it in a scalar way and relating it to the studies that other people have done. But I think it's really promising in terms of moving both measurement forward and our theory forward as well. So here's just some of the examples. Okay, here's some of the examples of things that people said when they were asked to describe that relation in terms of the story that they chose as being most similar to their relation. The Curie one, because we all love each other, we do anything for each other and respect each other. We champion one another, we selflessly love each other, we work to help and support one another. Not everybody felt close to their family, by the way. Families vary a great deal. And so some people's stories were about something that wasn't at all reciprocal. I don't want to claim that families are always reciprocal, but I just want to point out the language that they're using to describe why they chose that source story. And when they chose a source story that we hypothesized depicted a reciprocal relation, they used language that described that relation in a reciprocal way as well. Sometimes they chose the transmission chain and pointed out that there's a kind of transmission of care that happens in a family as well. When we ask people about the choice that they made for nature stories, they frequently talked about choosing the story that depicted a unidirectional relationship because they saw their relationship with nature as unidirectional. They get things out of nature, they explicitly pointed out. Many people wrote really interesting things about it not being possible for nature to know about them as well. Some people, however, did say that other types of stories were more representative of their relationship with nature. And very fascinatingly for us, when they talked about those transmission chains, they talked about their relationship with nature as a transmission chain. And sometimes they were very explicit about the fact that they felt responsible for handing down nature in the same way that in David's family, the cookbook was handed down. So it was a really lovely example for us. So I'm going to skip over this bit, if you don't mind, and just jump to the heart of it, which is that I'm proposing a new way of thinking about connection. By and large, psychologists and other researchers have conceptualized connection as either unidirectional without explicitly acknowledging that it's unidirectional, or as reciprocal. But connection can also be a kind of transmission chain as well. And it seems to be a really good direction for us to look in terms of thinking about defining connection both theoretically and empirically as well. So Barbara Kruger pointed out we're better connected, but we probably need to think about exactly how we're connected to really understand our connection as well. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Merideth, for this talk, which was so rich of different insights from the emergence of language, with turn taking to connection with nature, a lot of language here in the description of the relationship. And so besides elucidating the notion of connection, it also gives a lot of ideas on possible things to do. I open the discussion. Riccardo Venturini.
First of all, also appreciated the talk. I was very interested in the part of turn taking, since even the premises about the choices about the 3-year-olds and their difficulties in inhibition and turn taking, I would have predicted that since in the nature, I guess, their engagement with nature is very different from adults, so that maybe are more keen to being astonished by nature, but with some distance. Their engagement, and so the fact that can I climb that tree, or let's search for the frog, would have captured the attention and therefore facilitate less connected, less coherence in the turn taking. So how would you explain that instead you found the opposite?
So I skipped over that, but our justification in planning the study was that about 2 decades of studies have found that spending time in natural environments increases attentional capacity. And while we didn't measure attentional capacity here, we were building on that idea. And our hypothesis was that if spending time in natural environments increases attentional capacity, that should mean I'm better at listening to you and you're better at listening to me. And so then we should see more connected turn taking as a result. So it wasn't about the urgency of one stimulus versus another, but rather about attentional capacity driving that turn-taking relationship.
Federico Frau.
Thank you for this amazing talk. Just a couple of questions. First one being that whether you have tried to correlate the association between the connection with nature and the dyadic or unidirectional or the transition chains and the pro-environmental attitude that a person might have, because it seems that the transition chain might suggest a higher pro-environmental attitude, and whether you would predict that attending a training in improving the connection with nature would have differences or would lead to differences in the choice and the perception of unidirectional or transition chains in the connection with nature.
Okay, you'd have to hold on to the second one and remind me. So that's exactly where we're heading, though. Your first question about does the type of connection that you have influence, for example, what we often call moral concern for the environment. And we're measuring that in lots of different ways in some of the studies that we're doing, for example, with WWT or pro-environmental behavior. I'll just say parenthetically that I think measuring pro-environmental behavior is really, really difficult. I collaborate with Lorraine Whitmarsh on quite a lot of studies where we measure pro-environmental behavior. One of the things I've learned from those studies is that it's really like hit or miss and messy. And I don't know why that is about pro-environmental behavior. But that's just my observation about that kind of data. And by comparison, I think when you focus on moral concern for the environment, there's potential for more coherence. So I think that's probably where we'll be looking. I briefly mentioned that the data are really messy, and that's because in these first few studies that we did, we wanted to not constrain the participants too much. I think it's really important, like when we train, by the way, junior researchers, we often focus on like the tightest design, the most controlled, just two conditions, contrast, and all those things are great when you really know where you're headed. But until you understand the phenomenon that you're studying, that's a mistake. And so for that reason, we tried to unconstrain as much as possible to give the participant as much freedom as possible in those first few studies that we ran. In order for us to look at outcomes, we've got to move to a more constrained design, but we haven't done that yet. So that's still ahead for us. So the second thing you asked about.
Yeah, it was just speculation, actually. Whether by involving adults in our training to improve their connection with nature would lead to a transition from a unidirectional to a transition chain.
Yes. So basically, again, that's where we hope we're headed. I do feel like that's several steps away. And in particular, most nature-based interventions are basically, I mean, I don't want to caricature our project with WWT because I think it's extremely valuable. It's giving thousands of children the opportunity to spend time in nature when they don't have that chance. So I think it's really valuable. But nonetheless, it's kind of prototypical for these interventions, which is like, let's go to the wetlands and we'll run around and we'll have loads of fun. Don't you feel good? And a lot of nature-based interventions are kind of like that. Like social prescribing is also a lot like that. It's something that like I think about all the time about social prescribing is like, you know, you're telling people you should spend more time in nature so that you feel better. And so there's a lot of interventions that are really fundamentally about a unidirectional relationship with nature, but not explicitly acknowledging that that's the case. And I think we're opening up the possibility of thinking about the potential design of interventions that might be about making people more aware of the possibility sure, you might not feel like nature knows you're there, but you could pass it down, for example. So I think it does open up the possibility of intervention designs in the future.
I have a question on this. I will just ask because it's related, it's connected. Did you see if there's a relationship between how close individuals relate themselves to nature and the type of frame that they use to speak about
I skipped over that at the end as I kind of
Yeah.
sped up at the
Okay.
end, but broadly speaking, it looks like there is a relation. I do think we'll have to move to a more constrained design to be able to test those hypotheses more clearly.
Okay.
Because, for example, partly because I didn't want to constrain participants too much, we didn't even force people to say one of the stories is like my relation with my family or is like my relation with nature. So really, really kind of letting the participant drive it instead. And that creates all sorts of data loss, right? Because loads of people say like none of them. And so you've got to probably shift toward a kind of fewer choices, more forced choice. We also probably won't stay with these kind of cultural artifacts, I call them, these stories. I think they make really great models, but tons of people have already read that story about Taylor Swift. So we'll have to come up with something else, you know, so I think we'll come up with a more constrained design that also isn't about the real world in quite that way.
It's probably
and-
framing also, framing.
Yeah,
think
that's
this
right,
is frame,
absolutely.
but also
Yeah.
talking about nature, not the
Yeah.
in nature, but about.
Mhm. So we have some evidence that the story that they chose is related to their scalar choice.
Yeah.
Because that's what we want to do. We want to be able to relate it to the existing literature, not just say like, you know, ignore them, but rather say, let's try to interpret what's out there. And to do that, we'll probably have to have a more constrained design to have really neat data.
That might give him insights on the type of intervention.
Yeah, definitely,
So-
definitely.
Questions, other questions? Maddalena Bressler?
I really, thank you for the talk. I really appreciated the fact that you inserted the relationship with nature together with other types of relationship, whether humans, artifacts. But do you think that maybe a next step could be postulating and testing another type of relationship altogether, more specific? Because it seems to me that nature is something non-human. If we think of trees, plants, and so on, it's not really inanimate, though, because we know that, for example, trees and so on, they communicate, they move, they do things in a way, but we're still very anthropocentric, so we think that everything else that lives maybe lives like us. So do you think that it would be useful to think about another way of human, non-human plant interaction, so a next step, or would it be just going too far? And also, could there be any linguistic reflections of this? Because it seems to me that when you read books or also essays, so across registers, something people do to express they feel more connected to nature is using personifying metaphors. From the Gaia, log paradigm to more recent things. So it's quite, yeah, do you think there could be also linguistic reflection for this?
Absolutely. So,
Yeah.
so very, very much. Let me try to address your first question. I'm not sure this is quite what you're asking. But we've done another study in which we tried to understand the extent to which they think of, for example, nature as agentic. Oh, thank you so much. Because that seemed to be present in a lot of the descriptive accounts that people provided. And broadly speaking, it seemed like people only choose the reciprocal story as close to their relationship with nature if they also think nature can be agentic. Does that make sense? So loads of people basically think nature is inanimate, is not conscious in any way. And they seem to kind of create like a special status as a result, which is you can't have a relationship with something that isn't agentic. And some of the other studies that we're doing also with children, we're trying to understand a little bit better, like how granting agency might be related to moral concern. So for us, it kind of ties together your two different questions. So absolutely, there's just basically tons more work to do here. This feels like just like the barest of beginnings. But I guess for us, like really valuable in terms of like opening a window, because for a very long time, it's felt like thinking about nature connection, it's just done one way. And there's loads of people who say like, I developed a new scale for measuring nature connection because the other scales have like poor measurement properties. And their scale does pretty much the same thing that everyone else's scale does, you know, and so for us, this was very much instead trying to have a kind of radical rethink by going back to that idea that maybe when people talk about nature connection, it's a kind of analogy, but we're making assumptions about what it's an analogy to, about what the base is. In other words, we're jumping to the target without having any idea what the base is. That we know those terms in analogy, like the base here would be like, for example, Taylor and Joe, and the target would be you and nature. You asked another thing, and I'm sorry, I haven't addressed it.
No, it was the linguistic reflection.
Okay.
The boundaries of migration were fuzzier, so thank you.
I will say that I feel like there's a lot to be learned from linguistics in progressing this work.
Jeanette.
I think that's really interesting. That's one of the other studies that you've done, other people have done, that have kind of deconstructed or looked at the components of connection. Because I was thinking, for me, it's like it's maybe interaction, it's emotion, it's contact,
Yeah,
it's physical process.
so by and large, that's what these multi-item scales do. And the nasty graphs I showed you. I mean, that's an example of someone, I have a lot of admiration for them, you know, like they spent years basically saying, all right, everybody's measurement of nature connection isn't very good. We're going to start from theory and we're going to be really careful. We're going to do all the things you should do in scale development. And they have essentially, I forget, 4 or 5 different factors where both theoretically they predicted them, but psychometrically they hold up. All sorts of lovely things, but it's just got this terrible measurement property, which is that everybody says they're connected to nature. And how can that be at the same time as everybody's disconnected? Like somebody's lying.
Serena, later.
Thank you very much. This was really, really, really interesting and inspiring. And
Thank you.
Yeah, very much. So I guess I have many questions and issues, but one is related to this measurement issue. So if I got this right, towards the end of your talk, you were showing less ugly graphs. So you were showing less skewed distribution, and you seem to you got those from asking people how connected you feel to your family and how connected you feel to the nature. So the comparison there seemed to work quite well. I mean, how did you do that? Did you ask first one question and then the other? I mean, how do you think?
So I'll preface this a little bit by saying, because we're doing work with very young children around this, and furthermore, doing that work is really difficult because it's taking place all around the UK, and we can't count on teachers at all. So some of our data, like my students are like driving all around the UK to test thousands of children individually. It's totally nuts. But our main data sets is coming from essentially stuff we put in the post.
And then the teacher hands out a pack of papers to every child and so on. So we very quickly learned that we had to provide all the information in our pack that would orient the child to the task as well, you know? And so that meant that, for example, the very first connection question that people ask, sorry, I'm just thinking ahead to the data, it's actually quite funny. When we began this work, Queen Elizabeth was still alive. And my PhD student proposed that that was a great example of a connection where she said, we won't get really high scores, but like people will understand it. And let's ask them that before we ask them about their family. Or maybe we ask them their family and then Queen Elizabeth, but we wanted like at least two different social connections that they were rating to orient them to the task. And it was never intended to be our data. After Queen Elizabeth died, we had to change it to King Charles, and everyone's way less connected to him. I'll just say, that's our largest effect size ever. Everyone's way less connected to him. So in other words, we're like contextualizing these kinds of judgments anyway. And so we'd already done that kind of work, and we knew that it was really useful in terms of orienting people to the task, but it's clearly not enough to drive the ratings down, right? Like you've just said, you're a 5 closeness to your family. And then the majority of children say they're also a 5 closeness to nature. And most of these children have almost no exposure to nature at all. And so, you know, that alone, I think what we see is that's just not enough. And so here, the idea was to instead think about really deeply contextualizing it by getting people to read these stories and think about connections in those stories, both as thinking ahead about potential interventions and training programs and so on, but also about, you know, maybe if you really embed people's ratings about nature by first getting them to think about social connections more deeply, then it will shift. It's also the case that people chose, I need to double check this because I can't quite remember, but I'm pretty sure that people chose the source story before they gave the quantitative rating about nature, for example. So they've already said, my relation with nature is most like my relation to Taylor and Joe. And they gave a answer that was very correlated with their answer about Taylor and Joe, their scalar rating. So that seems to drive it, in other words, a little bit. So that measurement issue is partly about a deeper kind of contextualization. It's not enough to say, how close are you to King Charles?
And there's about connections being more connected talk being more frequent in nature than in the field. Very interesting because we know in developmental psychology that's what happens within a connected conversation or the effects that what happens within a connected conversation is very different from the effects that unconnected conversations have. So this
Yeah, every developmentalist knows that like most of the time your data is so messy that you have no idea what your result is going to be until you've like done all of the, you know, transcription and coding and secondary coding. It's so complicated, right? But honestly, we stood there in the park and I said, we've got it. I just couldn't believe it. It was visible. And I never show videos during talks because it's too often that they go wrong. But I could show you so many videos where like the mom is like, you know, come make this butterfly. And the child is like, why is it that blah, blah, when they're inside, you know? But once they're outside, it's just like, it's so in sync. It's really remarkable. It's on both sides. So I didn't present that, but that's in our paper that we also tested, you know, is the parent more responsive in nature compared, because the parent is more responsive than the child generally, but the parent improves in nature, and the child improves in nature. So it happens on both sides. I would love to convince politicians of it. We need, I think, a lot like larger data sets to convince them of that. But for me, like that has a lot of public health implications.
And you think that, let's say, the mediating factor is this increased attention?
Yeah, so we didn't measure that primarily because there's only so many data points you can get from a 3 or 4-year-old, you know, and I skipped over this, but the reason you can see what they're seeing in those photos I showed is because they're wearing a head cam. And so just getting the head cam on them was like, so we couldn't also have them do attention measures and all these other things, you know, in a future study, probably with older kids, I think.
There's a question from a parent. We were commenting this result before the seminar, so I'm curious to see what he asked. Paolo Canal.
Just wondering if the difference between nature in public park.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It matters what the quality, I imagine, I expect that it matters what the quality of the natural environment is. We have extremely little data as a field about that. We don't even have really good ways of measuring quality of the environment. Right now, the default way to measure quality of environment is to give, for example, adults a questionnaire that says like, rate your local park. And that kind of measurement is so messy. I'm pretty sure the right way to do this is with online measurement, that it might include, for example, like head cams combined with mobile, eye tracking, EEG, you know, we would need so much more, but absolutely, yeah, I agree. It's a very ideal natural environment that we measured it in.
I think that the discussion could go on and on, but we need to free the room at 6:30, and then it's already 6:33. The students are arriving, and we thank Meredith for this wonderful and inspiring talk. Thank you.
Thank you.